next and last talk will be held by Steve Best. He is a professor, a philosophy professor in Texas El Paso, and now he will explain us his concept of total liberation. Steve Best.
Yes. The other day, after my last talk, someone asked me the big question, popped me the big question, and that was, what do we do? What do we do after you painted this fairly grim picture? How can we change things? How can we bring systemic change? How can we revolutionize society? Just what do we do? Where do we start? How do we begin? And I typically fumble with that question, as I did then, but really I should have just said, come to my talk on Sunday. That's what this talk is about, really. This talk is an answer to that question. And this talk, I hope, will weave together some of the core sub-themes of this conference, which is how to make a better vegan and animal rights movement. Unless you all think that we're at the pinnacle of our perfection. There's been some really stunning successes here and there, but as I like to put it, we've won some battles, but we're losing the war. We want to win the war, the larger struggle, not just a few skirmishes here and there. And so how can we do that as a vegan animal rights movement? What are our contributions to history, to humanity? These are some of the things I want to talk about today. And one of the sub-themes of the conference, again, is how to make the vegan animal rights movements better. Well, I think we need to dig them deeper and dig them wider and open this thing up, wide open to a whole lot of different connections and new ways of thinking and new forms of history that we haven't engaged very well yet, by and large. Now, the crisis in our world that I spoke about the other day, with climate change or resource wars and scarcity and social and environmental catastrophes erupting everywhere. This crisis in our society and in a global commons is so deep and it's so pervasive, so broad that no one theory and no one tactic, no one political orientation, no political approach can solve it. Not one theory, not one politics can address it on its own. It's just too broad, it's too multifaceted, it's too deep. So there is a need, first of all, theoretically, for what I call multi-perspectival theory. That's a big word. Big word, but simple meaning. It just means theory from theorize power and domination from different perspectives. Gender perspective, race perspective, class perspective, right? So we need a multi-perspectival theory to understand power and domination and to understand history, the evolution of human history. And we need to understand how these various forms of oppression and domination, as Patrice was talking about quite lucidly, how these various forms of oppression support one another, underpin one another, reinforce one another, and together, catalyze one another, together create structures of domination that work together and feed off one another. And we need to understand how that works theoretically then, and we need different perspectives for that. No one perspective. For instance, a class perspective, we learned that over a century ago. Class perspective cannot illuminate racism and sexism very well, does not illuminate culture, everyday life, a whole lot of things. You can't illuminate from a class perspective, but boy, do we need a class perspective. Still, Marxism is not dead. We still need a class perspective to understand capitalism. There's still a capitalist society, last time I checked. We still need to talk about class exploitation, alienation, domination, commodification, etc. We need to still talk about class. But we need to talk about some other things too, which is where we're going to come in. So that's the theoretical approach to understanding these various forms of domination and the multifaceted nature of this crisis. This is what I call multi-perspectival theory. Now, the political equivalent or corollary of that is what I call alliance politics, a common name, alliance politics. So if we're going to look at the problem analytically from different perspectives, we got to solve it politically from also different perspectives, different social movements, different social critiques, different social positions. And what alliance politics does is to build bridges across these different movements. Typically, we tend to burn bridges rather than build them. We need to start building bridges across different social movements and working against common enemies and in favor of common goals. Now, we do have some common enemies, all the different social movements you can imagine, including ours. And one, certainly, I'm afraid to say, is capitalism. Capitalism is incompatible with the kind of world we seek. It is a system based upon predatory violence, exploitation. It feeds off the misery of the poor and the oppressed. It creates inequality by its very nature and structure, and it is inherently unsustainable. This system has got to go. Now, how we can do this is one question. We need to be frank in recognizing that we need systemic change. We cannot have a marketized society globally with the only restrictions being against anything that inhibits free trade. We need to abolish this system and create a rational society, a democratic, cooperative, rational society, where we share things and we create relationships of justice and equality in profound ways, and that is not possible within this current social framework. So we have a common enemy, I think, something to talk about there, and we have common values, don't we? All the different social movements, it's not hard to configure ours on what they do already. Peace, justice, democracy, community, equality. It's pretty much what we're talking about, isn't it? It's the same values. So we have common values. We just need to get other social movements to understand that we're really talking about the same thing. We have the same values that you have. We're just going to extend them to the next level. Just going to carry it, a little higher because you forgot. You cut off the moral boundary line here. We got to raise that open. And we got to address the animals and the earth and human beings. So broadly, multi-perspectival theory and alliance politics express the unity of the human, earth, and animal liberations. The movements for human, earth, animal liberation. And when we start to put these movements together, we get what I call total liberation. Of course, I didn't invent that term. It's been around for a while, and other people use it in various ways. But I've tried, like others, to give it some theoretical substance and to do some of the analysis of this term, because when we think in terms of total liberation rather than single issue animal or vegan politics, we start thinking in a very different and much more profound way, and we get new possibilities for both thought and for action. When we say total liberation, some people don't know quite what that means. Total liberation is not a metaphysical concept. It's not saying that everyone is going to be free all the time, everywhere. Sartre told us that, freedom is a precarious thing. You don't just get freedom and you're free. You have to struggle for it every minute. Someone will always be there to take it away from you. It's not like everyone is totally going to be free in every possible way, whatever that might mean. That's not what the concept of total liberation means. That's getting into metaphysics. Metaphysics, what does freedom mean? Well, we can deal with that. But what total liberation is, it's a systemic, holistic, relational mode of analysis. Again, theorizing things from different perspectives. And politics. Again, alliance politics. So what we do with total liberation is link up different perspectives and use different perspectives and link or build bridges amongst different struggles. And while we could talk about all different kinds of struggles, including gay, lesbian, indigenous peoples, etc., I just want to I'm going to create a number of simplified abstractions today. And so we're just going to lump those as human, animal, and earth liberation struggles, although, of course, there's a lot of division within all those different categories. Now, there has been a general recognition in the last few decades that we need to connect social issues and ecological issues. It finally dawned on Marxists, for instance, in the 1970s and 80s that capitalism is inherently unsustainable. It's destroying the environment. People started to become aware of environmental issues, certainly by the 60s and 70s. And that we need to link socialism and ecology. So you get eco-socialism, socialist ecology, Marxist ecology, eco-anarchism, all varieties of linking left critiques and theoretical political frameworks and ecology, which was always excluded. It was considered a bourgeois concern somehow in the 1960s in the US, for instance. That changed in the 1970s. So the left started to get the idea that we need to link social and environmental movements. For instance, Earth First. Thanks to the pioneering visions of Judy Bari, Earth First began to form alliances, not spike trees anymore. They gave that up to form alliances with women and timber workers. It was really quite a profound thing to do. The environmental justice movements that Patrice talked about the other day, that emerged in the US in the 1880s, 1890s, linking race, class, and environmental issues together. Social movements and environmental movements. The Zapatistas, of course, were a social political revolutionary movement, and ecology was at the center of their values and their struggle. As I mentioned, one of the things that triggered the Zapatista revolts in Chiapas, Mexico, in the 90s was the issue of land reform, the centralization of land, the domination of ranch owner interests, etc. And the anti or alter globalization struggles typically have created new forms of alliances that didn't exist before, which included social and environmental movements. But these are profound changes, and these give us a lot of new possibilities, but something huge is missing here. There's a critical piece of the puzzle that is left out. The equation is not yet balanced, because all of this is really to further the interest of one species, Homo sapiens. And the interests of millions of other species on this planet have been left out. So whether it's eco-socialism or eco-anarchism, we're still dealing with a speciesist framework. We're still dealing with a bogus notion of community and unity and inclusivity. And we still are ignoring one of the most profound problems haunting human history, literally haunting human history as a problem yet to be dealt with. The problem, the consequences of what happens when we exploit animals and when we eat meat. These issues have to be addressed. They have to be addressed by social movements. And thus, neither social justice nor environmentalism are possible, I want to argue, until they incorporate animal liberation and veganism. And conversely, veganism and animal liberation, our goals, our values, our ultimate hopes, are impossible to attain without the help of social movements. We are too small, too elite, too privileged, too lacking in diversity, too marginalized socially to accomplish anything on our own. Anything of real substance. We are too small and too marginalized, and you wonder why sometimes. Well, Brandon gave us some pointers on that. We all know from our experience. Some of our failures in building bridges, not building bridges with other movements, really not, and the ways in which we tend to alienate other groups. And we're not attentive to because we have that single issue focus. And if you keep that single issue focus, it doesn't matter what they think, right? Well, guess what it does? It matters to the animals, it matters to the earth, it matters to the urgency of our goals and to effectively accomplishing them. So I want to argue that it truly is one struggle and one fight. And in this fight, we unite to advance the politics of total liberation. And I think total liberation is the politics of the 21st century. It's the politics of the 21st century because its time has come. Now is the time to unite. Now is the time to deepen our struggles. Now is the time for a total systemic vision. Total systemic vision of what our problems are and how we can begin to address them collectively. Not us against them, the social movements, but us with them and them with us. We will not find a viable path out of this planetary crisis without a total liberation politics in some sense, I suggest. Now, normally, if I had the time or I was writing an essay or something, I would mediate all three concerns, human, animal, animal, earth, earth, human, you go back and forth. We mediate all the different perspectives and concerns, but that's too complicated for now. So I don't have that much time. So what I'm just going to do is focus on two aspects of this, the social movements and human rights, justice struggles, and our struggle, veganism and animal rights. And I'm going to, just for simplicity's sake, leave out environmentalism. because that just gets too complex when you add 3 factors in instead of just 2. I'm going to make another shortcut, if I can, and to just tell you what I mean by left. First of all, that's the generalizations. I'm going to use some generalizations here. You have to give me some slack on that. By left, I mean the far radical spectrum of politics, the Marxist, anarchist, socialist, syndico-anarchist, whatever you want. Leninist, Maoist, Trotskyist, all the anti-capitalists, all the different flavors of anti-capitalism, radical socialism and communism. I certainly mean that by the left. But I also mean the whole spectrum of progressive thought, liberal thought, left liberal thought. In the U.S., there's the term social progressives, people who are against guns, people who are in favor of gay rights and gay marriage, and people who believe in social equality and that the government ought to support the needy. These kinds of things are typically progressive values, not conservative values. So by left, I mean the radical left all the way up to the liberals, okay? Because the liberals certainly, too, are humanistic and speciesistic in their thinking, and we're going to be dealing with liberals as well as hardcore leftists in alliance politics. By the way, with alliance politics, it's about unity, but it's also about differences. We're going to have differences with other groups. We're going to find that common ground and struggle to find that and work around that, and maybe we can work out some of our differences. Later we can veganize them. Veganism is a non-starter. It really is. Maybe I'll come back to that and through an example another way. So that's what I mean by left. And when I talk about the vegan animal rights movements, I should maybe talk about vegan animal advocacy movements, because I really want to look at the whole spectrum of the animal community, and we've got 3 divisions there that you all know are quite common. The welfarist groups, the rights approach, and the liberationist approach. For me, the welfare and rights approach is like a family squabble. They really have more in common than they share differently from the liberationist approach. The liberationist approach is in favor of illegal underground direct action or forceful action, etc. Both of these groups disfavor that, and then both of them condemn that as violence. We had an example of that the other day with Mr. I forget his name. So, I don't mean to obscure the differences, the types of variety of veganism and animal rights. And I realize that some animal rights people and vegans are political, and they are leftist, and they are progressive, and they are social and political. I recognize that. But by and large, correct me if I'm wrong later, by and large, it seems a safe generalization that animal rights and veganism is a single issue, mainstream, reformist, typically white elitist kind of agenda and project. And that's why we're so small, and that's why we're so marginalized. So I'm going to make that generalization when I talk about our movement. Now, back to the main comparison, the left versus veganism and animal rights. The left says this to us: oh, Mr. Vegan and Ms. Animal Activist, you are reformist, you are elitist, you are sexist, you are racist. These elements exist in your community. I even see fascism in your community. Or would you be looking towards France? I see fascism in your community, and I see misanthropy. These elements exist in our movement, don't they? In some aspects of our movement. I just came to learn a lot about the degree to which fascism exists in the animal welfare movement. Quite shocking. It has no place in our movement. No place, but it exists. And people are taking this issue over. I'll come back to that point. Misanthropy, well, that certainly exists, and we can find, obviously, with PETA, elements of sexism and racism. Really, what the left says about us is true. And if you want to get a good indication of how the left feels about us, well, brace yourself. You go on some of these anarchist pages, like Indie Media, for instance, and you read the section on animal rights, and you read the discussion forums, and their comments are so ignorant, they're so vile, they're so immature, they're so petty, they're so hateful. They fucking hate us. And it's obvious when you read the commentary of leftists against animal rights and vegans. You got to ask, why do they have these perceptions or misperceptions? Why do they feel this way? Boy, do we have a long way to go to change the minds of these people that we have to learn how to work with. We really do. Now, we say to the left, conversely, well, look at you. You claim to be progressive and you claim to have all these values and you flout them. You contradict them over and over again. You leave out huge aspects of life that needs moral protection, legal protection. You're ignorant. You're backwards. You're inconsistent. You're speciesist. That about sums it up. You're a speciesist. And leftists are quite stubborn speciesists. Quite stubborn. I've been living in the left, active in the left, talking to left people for some 30 years now. I can tell you, this is true. The left is damn stubborn, and they're not very enlightened. So what the left says to the animal rights and vegan people, what we say to them, guess what? Both critiques are right. We're both right about each other. And what we don't realize is that we need each other. We need each other because the only way to correct the flaws being pointed out in our positions is through the critique and absorbing the truth of the other's position. In other words, if we really listen to the left, we have a hell of a lot to learn from them. And conversely, they have a lot to learn from us. Have a lot to learn from us. So I'm suggesting we need to open up some new dialogues. Now, we need various standpoints to understand history, as I mentioned, but scholars on the left have ignored completely or under-theorized the animal standpoint, what I call the animal standpoint. The animal standpoint is analyzing history and social dynamics, like power and domination, from the perspective of our relationship to animals, what we do to animals. And very few histories, look at what we do to animals and the social, political, environmental consequences of that. That's what I call the animal standpoint. And if we use the animal standpoint, whoa, history gets a whole new light and patina to it that we haven't discerned before. And you can, for instance, look at a book by Jim Mason's a good example, called An Unnatural Order, where he studies the origins of hierarchical society from agriculture, and he looks at the commonalities of oppression. And the whole book is written from the animal standpoint. And it's really quite profound, and we get a lot of new insights from this that we can all learn from. So the animal standpoint tells us that our social power and domination systems, our dominator societies are driven by speciesism, and that animals, the exploitation of animals, has been a key dynamic in structuring change in society and the natural world. Speciesism arguably is the first hierarchy in history. And that means it underpins sexism, racism, homophobia, and other things in some important ways. And that means that we can't understand any of those concepts without understanding speciesism. And that means that our critique and the animal standpoint has a lot of analytic value to shed upon understanding other social power dynamics. So speciesism underpins oppression in some really important ways. And you can begin to understand the importance of speciesism for getting the outlines of history and understanding power and dynamics, power and domination dynamics, if you look to Aristotle. Aristotle was perhaps, I think, certainly the first Western theorist of domination and a hierarchy. And he built his hierarchical system off of a basic opposition between human and non-human animals. For Aristotle, briefly, there is a hierarchical order to the universe, and it's purposeful. The universe is purposeful. There's a purpose for things in the universe. And the hierarchical ordering was a scale of perfection. In medieval times, this was called the Great Chain of Being, a scale of perfection, where according to the degree of rationality, this is the fetishization of rationality. And the more rationality you had, the more perfect you were. And lesser beings exist to serve the purposes of higher beings because they have lesser degrees of rationality. So Aristotle said, I quote, "Plants exist for the sake of animals, just as animals exist for the sake of men." So we have this hierarchical universe that is also purposeful, and everyone takes their place in it according to the degree of rationality they have. Well, how did he get the basic distinction between between rational and irrational or non-rational? Where did he get that? Well, it was easy. It was easy because we built our human identities, human supremacism, if you will, Speciesism, we built our speciesist identities to exist for at least 10,000 years from the fundamental opposition between human and non-human animals. We look at the animals and we say they lack reason. They're dumb, brute beasts. They lack reason. They don't have what we have. We're unique. We're special. We began defining ourselves outside the circle of ecology, outside the community of life. As something singular, unique, the crown of creation we define ourselves as. So speciesism, that firm separation of us versus them, human versus non-human animals, and that they exist to serve our purposes, that underpins sexism and racism. And I'll tell you how real quickly. We put animals in a category I call the moral basement. We just take them, drag them down here. They lack rationality, so they lack moral value. We can do anything we want to them. They exist for our purposes. At best, we should treat them kindly, but that's usually left out. Now, once you got the moral basement, you got a category for creating hierarchies. You got a category for stripping beings of all moral value. It's quite easy to take women, just like on a computer, right? Just slide them down in there. People of color, slide them into that category too. Colonial subjects, oh, they go in there. The disabled, they go in there. Mentally disturbed, they go in there. Because the category already exists. All you got to do is assign to the next category you want to oppress, the next group of people, women, people of color, African slaves, whatever. You just got to say that they're animals. You just got to say that they lack reason. You just got to say they're not as intelligent as white Europeans. And they go into that category. Similarly, it's been commonly noted that every major war, every major conflict, certainly many, it's a repeating pattern throughout history. The subject that power is seeking to conquer, the subject is always reduced to the status of animals. That makes it easy to dehumanize them and to kill them, to massacre them without conscience. So the enemy is always a rat, a pig, a vermin, cockroach, some kind of animal, dogs, right? And so before sword play, there's always word play. You always have to first denigrate and dispose of your enemy, put them in a moral basement there with animals, call them animals, and then everything. Then there's no holds barred after that. Then you can dispose of them as you like, because the category of speciesism, of beings who have no value because they lack reason or lack the same reason that we superior humans have. You just put them in the category and the rest follows automatically. So the animal standpoint is really crucial for understanding history and for the construction of social hierarchies. And there are key conceptual and political relationships between speciesism, racism, etc. Now, progressives who fight for peace, justice, and equality need to recognize our issue for two reasons. One, it's really hard to fathom calling yourself a progressive if you don't understand the moral problem, however you want to deal with it otherwise, the moral problem of killing billions of innocent beings every year, tens of billions every year, and the toll keeps climbing. And if you can't understand that as a moral problem that deserves your attention and your knowledge and your compassion, then I'm sorry, you do not fucking deserve the term progressive. That is regressive. So just get off your throne of hypocrisy and admit that you're not that progressive. Because this is a really serious issue, animal suffering. And they also ought to recognize, but this is perhaps asking a bit too much, that the sea change that we need to navigate our way out of this crisis is exactly the kind of psychological, moral, spiritual change that our movements can bring to humanity. We can affect that profound change in human consciousness, perhaps we alone. Environmentalists can't do it. They can teach us about ecology, but you know who has the only, you might think this is funny coming from me, who has the only nonviolent ethic of all the social movements? Us. Us, not environmentalists. You can kill animals so long as you preserve the species and the ecosystem. You can kill the individual. There's no value. There's value on the system, not the individual life. We are the only movement that truly has a nonviolent ethic, a universal nonviolent ethic. We bring that gift to the future and to the struggle. And never forget it. They need to not only grasp the moral dimensions of what we're saying and doing, but the ecological dimensions. Because we all know, I don't need to emphasize this, the ecological consequences of a meat-based diet versus a vegan diet, and the sustainability problem with the waste of resources to produce meat for a growing population of human beings, especially coming out of China, India, the modernizing world, who by definition of modernization now are turning to meat-based diet. And sometimes this is something that's under-theorized, underappreciated, the roles that animals play in preserving ecosystems, whether they're elephants or dung beetles. Certainly the pollinators, right? The butterflies and the bees. I forget what the statistic is. There's something like 7 out of 10 foods that we eat or something are dependent upon the pollinators. Animals preserve the environment. They preserve biodiversity. You see the connections here? So if we massacre animals, we destroy their habitat, we're going to destroy the environment. It's going to have a profound effect on us, even our food supply. So the left needs to realize that. And there are many things that they can learn and get from us. But there's a lot we could gain from listening to their critique. So what does the left say against us? Well, number one, we're single issue. And that's by and large true, aren't we? We focus on single campaigns. At best, we focus on the movement generally, vegan movement, animal rights movement. We don't tend to make the connections to other social movements. So we're single issue. The problem with that is it abstracts speciesism from a complex network of forms of oppression that are interrelated, as I've emphasized. It allows for the instrumental use of other people's oppressions and histories for our purposes. Because we don't care if we alienate other social groups. We're just in it for the animals. A very counterproductive way of thinking. And again, here, PETA is the classic case. Of course, women in cages alienates feminists. So we lose a whole important block of people, of a social movement that we really need working with us, and we have, whether we realize it or not, profound connections with. Another PETA stunt that was pulled that many people don't know about is one time some activists donned KKK suits, right? The pointy white hats, just for a publicity stunt. I got to tell you, that's a real bridge builder. That's really going to get to the people of color. Didn't I see you clowns in a KKK suit? It wasn't me, but yeah, I'm sorry, man, it was my movement. So, you know, that's what single issue thinking can do to you. It can have those damaging kinds of effects. Single issueism allows for contradictions in our movement that are really disabling. A few years ago, 10 years ago or so, the darling of the U.S. animal rights movement for the day, the soup du jour, was Matthew Scully. Matthew Scully wrote a book called Dominion that was widely praised. Well, it was okay for the first 3 chapters before it bogged down in theology. But Matthew Scully was a right-wing neocon warrior. This guy was in the upper echelons of the Washington elite. He was a player. This is a guy who worked with presidents to the extent that he wrote Bush's speeches for the invasion of the Iraq War, the first and second invasion of Iraq wars. He wrote those speeches. He legitimated that war, the military use of energy, the killing of people. God knows what the effect on animals was. He legitimated that war. He uses words like magic to make that war happen, to help make it happen, legitimate it. And then, as if that weren't enough, he wrote the coming out speech for Sarah Palin. You remember that? That folksy Hi America speech. Welcome, America. I'm your new Nazi darling. He wrote that speech. Now, if that's not bad enough, you can't see the connection between supporting the far right and their military power establishment and what that means for animals and humans and the earth. You're going to support that because he wrote a book about animals and factory farming and hunting? And you're going to support that? That's more important than, his book is more important than these larger issues? Well, Sarah Palin, of course, was a hunter. Here's a guy whose morality is so corrupt, he took a paycheck to support hunting he just wrote a book against. That's what single-issue thinking can do to you. Because people promoted him. I had an argument with a very prominent activist in the movement about this guy. And it led to a falling out in our friendship. And he said, you know, he was so single issue. I said, can you not see the contradictions here with Matthew Scully? He didn't care. He said, hey, you know, he's vegan friendly. He's an animal activist. That's all I need to know. Well, that is so counterproductive. We're also, thanks to single-issue myopia, if you will, we're largely unaware of or indifferent to the plight of oppressed peoples. And hence we have a very narrow vision of the world, very thin politics. You look on people's Facebook pages. Do you see much stuff about the third world, about oppression, about indigenous struggles, about ecological resistance movement? Or is it all just animal stuff and vegan stuff and recipes and pictures of soup? Probably the latter. We wonder why we're so small and marginalized. Just look at your own damn Facebook page, you know? What's on it? Wow, a whole lot of recipes, a lot of animal campaigns, nothing about other people's struggles, nothing about the environment, nothing about resistance movements, nothing about power structures, nothing about Syria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're largely unaware of and indifferent to these things. We're reformists, the left will say, and yes, we typically are. We're reformists. We seek change within the movement. That means we don't challenge the structures of power, of economic and political and military power generally. We don't challenge these. We try to live within these comfortably. Maybe we don't like them. We don't develop a systemic critique. We don't protest them. It doesn't dominate our discourse. And so we really lack a larger theoretical vision and a larger politics. And we're reformists. And even if you're abolitionist, right, a so-called abolitionist, well, you're still just abolishing one form of oppression. And what about the others? I say let's not just abolish speciesism or the property status of animals. Let's abolish capitalism. More specifically, let's abolish hierarchical domination in every facet. If we're going to talk about abolition, let's get serious. We want to abolish hierarchical domination, period. Speciesism is one profound aspect of it, but let's not mince our words and let's really fight the fight. So the system, because we don't pay much attention to it, and because we're reformists, it easily absorbs our critiques. Capitalism absorbed civil rights, no problem to the extent that it did. It went on functioning without a beep. Lauren pointed out that when King started challenging the war and poverty and inequality, that's when he got dangerous. Right? So we're not dangerous like that. And veganism, for instance, I'm sorry to say, just to be honest, veganism is entirely co-optable. It's completely marketized. Veganism is vegan capitalism. Capitalism loves veganism. It loves veganism. Have you seen some of these vegan magazines, these glossy vegan magazines? My God, they're like pornography. Just, whoa, look at all the colors and look at all these things, all these goods I can have, all these goods I can buy, and all these happy, smiley, white people. They're all happy and smiling, you know? You just get a really warm, fuzzy feeling about the world when you read these vegan magazines. I know I do. You know, I want to curl up with one in bed, fireplace, the cat, and just, think nice thoughts. So, we're reformists. Our struggles are easily co-opted. They're not challenging or subversive. They are economically, they are psychologically, but we really haven't tooled them right. So we don't have a critique of these power structures, and mostly what vegans and animal activists advocate, and this is certainly good, it's a necessary part of the problem, we advocate moral and spiritual change. We don't advocate political institutional change. We need moral spiritual change. We also need economic and political change. And there's a real dearth, a real absence of that kind of speaking, those kind of demands in our movement. Now, finally, the left would say to us, well, you're kind of apolitical, really. There are politics in our movement, conservative, left, liberal, and radical. There's different kinds of politics in our movement. We're kind of apolitical generally, but I call it big tent politics. People who take this big tent approach. We want to bring everyone into the movement. So don't alienate people with politics. The conservatives, don't go off of Matthew Scully, Steve. Okay? We want the conservatives in our camp. And he's a right-wing neocon fascist warrior, but okay, we want him in our camp, He's important to us. That kind of thinking is very inhibiting. Let me tell you something that occurred to me some time ago. Whether you realize it or not, and I don't care what your politics are, this movement is a left-wing movement. This movement is a left-wing movement, and I'll tell you why. Look at the values we embrace. Equality, democracy, inclusivity, non-discrimination, non-hierarchy, rights, justice, peace, nonviolence. These are left-wing values. Where the hell do you think these came from? From the radical movements, from the progressive movements, from the liberal movements of the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. These are left-wing values. Right-wing values are hierarchy, military, family, nation, borders, war, security. That's not what we talk about. We talk about the opposite. Our heritage, whether we realize it or not, is from the left. You could be a conservative, just try to recognize this. And we're trying to build on the limitations of the left. We're trying to, build this moral trajectory beyond where the left says it stops here. And we say, no, it begins there, and we're going to take it to where we need to take it, to a planetary ethic. So this is a left-wing movement, and there is, therefore, a natural opening between us and the left. Now, our critique of the left, let's flip this around a little bit. Well, we can't help but notice the hypocrisy of the left and progressive people. First of all, in their theorizing, their so-called dialectics. They see all these connections, but they leave out the animal standpoint. They may get the environmental question, they never get the animal question. And so we find all kinds of problems with left-wing hypocrisy. And if you ever talk to a leftist, it might be over lunch or dinner. They're railing against capitalism, exploitation. The workers, are oppressed, and the reduction of life value to a commodity. Hey, would you pass me another bucket of chicken wings, please? And they're talking to you, and they're smearing pig grease all over their face, and you're wondering, what the hell is this? How do I get out of this situation? Oh, boy. I've been in that situation so many times. They're munching on KFC and they're talking about capitalist oppression. Hey, man, do you see anything wrong with this picture, my friend? So sometimes you hear oppressed people, just like on CNN News, and not part of any group or something, but certainly from social groups. But people always say, they come from this terrible oppression or kidnapping or torture. They say they treated us like animals. Treated us like animals. Everybody goes, oh, no. Oh, you poor thing. As if treating animals that way, of course, is acceptable. Right? Well, if they would only treat animals and only animals that way, the world would be fine. But they treated us like animals. So that's a really huge problem there. Now, Western Marxist, anarchist, socialist traditions, they've internalized the worst of Western ideology, the absolute worst. They have forged progressive values in many ways. They have championed science and technology, but they've been behind the curve in terms of revolutions. They dropped the ball. Well, they never had the ball. What am I saying? They missed the animal rights revolution. They missed the revolution of cognitive ethology, which is the science of animal intelligence. And so they still think animals are brute beasts lacking rationality. They completely missed these scientific and moral revolutions. So the left has internalized speciesism and anthropocentrism in a very deep and profound way. The domination of nature has been a left Marxist project for a while. That got changed a little bit when the left took an ecological turn. But again, it never took the anti-speciesist turn. So it just absorbed the worst of Western history, uncritical. And it claims to hold the mantle of enlightened progressive thinking. So there's a bit of a problem there. The spectacle of left speciesism is everywhere. I can't tell you how many journal articles I've read in magazines like Mother Jones or The Progressive, in These Times, etc., left liberal magazines. They cover slaughterhouses. They talk about slaughterhouses. And I'll be damned if they talk about capitalist oppression, exploitation, migration, all these things, but they don't mention the animals, except something the workers have to deal with. You are at the avant-garde of political thinking in some sense, and you completely miss the problem of factory farming, the moral problem, and the ecological problem. You just focus on the workers. In contrast, Gail Eisnitz wrote a book called Slaughterhouse. And what Gail Eisnitz analyzed was how both the workers and the animals were exploited, and how in exploiting the animals, and Patrice did a really nice job on this with a nice metaphor about the heart, the damping, I forget exactly the word, but the damping, the dulling of the heart. And when your heart is dulled when exploiting animals, you better believe it's going to be dulled in your relationship to other people. And so Gail documented how a lot of these workers, when they came home, well, they took it out on their kids and wives too. They're dehumanized, they're psychologically scarred. But there's a difference of a more holistic approach versus the typical left approach. And why can't they talk about both things? There's a guy named Michael Albert, who was quite a theorist at one time of an anarchist persuasion. And he gave an interview to Satya magazine some years back when that was still around. And he said this, he confessed. They asked him about animal rights. When I talk about the social movements to make the world better, animal rights does not come to my mind. I honestly don't see animal rights in anything like the way I see women's movements, Latino movements, youth movements, and so on. A large-scale discussion of animal rights, it's probably more than needed, but it just doesn't strike me as being remotely urgent as preventing war in Iraq or winning a 30-hour work week. Wow. Oh, that's very deep. That's very generous of you morally. You don't see anything of importance in the animal rights movement, despite the fact that we are revolutionizing human thinking. We are scrambling the nerve centers of the human brain with a speciesist critique, and you see nothing significant in that. We are rewiring the human brain, if you will, with our critique and changing our identities and the way that we walk on this earth. And you can't see the importance of that, Michael Albert. And you think that getting a relatively privileged class of beings, I know workers are exploited, but come on. A relatively privileged class of beings, reducing their work week from 40 hours to 30 hours is more important than liberating tens of billions of beings whose massacre is destroying the natural world and our social world in ways we're just beginning to understand. And you don't get that, Michael Albert. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't see much important about you. You can look at the apex of humanism in Martin Luther King. He wrote an essay that is fantastic. It's called The World House. And he had this vision in the late 60s. Shortly before he died, he wrote this essay, The World House. And he says, I dream of a world that's a cosmopolitan universe. And I dream of a world that's no longer scarred by race, by poverty, by war, and by class. I dream of this new house, this world house, this global community. I dream of that. Well, that's a pretty impressive vision. I like that. But one thing's been left out, the animals. You forgot about the animals, Martin. And so your world house, whatever your intentions or whatever marginal remarks you made about animals or something akin to our concerns, your world house is still a goddamn slaughterhouse until we stop eating animals. Your world house is still a madhouse until we stop eating and killing animals. There's no world house with a slaughterhouse. It's just a madhouse. And so, in my own trajectory, starting off on the left, becoming a vegetarian, becoming an animal rights activist, realizing that was the most inclusive, powerful form of activism, and then becoming a vegan and broadening my vision to total liberation, I came to a conclusion. The conclusion is this. Leftism is Stalinism toward animals. Any revolution that liberates one species on the back of millions of others is no revolution at all. That is not revolutionary change. That's just more of the same. That's just changing the regime, the humanist speciesist regime. And profound change eludes us. Now, to make some concluding remarks, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay, no problem. The human, earth, and animal liberation movements, we have a lot to learn from one another. We have a lot to learn. Veganism and animal liberation could gain new critical perspectives by engaging radical social discourse and histories of oppression, by using Marxist categories, etc., in a fruitful way. Left progressives, they can help temper the ahistorical, elitist, misanthropic elements of our movement. They can deepen our political understandings of the world, and they give us categories to think of in terms of society and political history. And conversely, those in dialogue with us could gain new insights into the dynamics of hierarchy and domination and environmental destruction, and they could develop more effective political tactics and politics, and they could grow too. They could grow too. Imagine if they had us on their team and they were on our team. And all parties would ultimately benefit by acquiring new perspectives and by adding a different diversity to their politics and a different layer of struggle. All would grow wiser, all would grow in numbers, and together we could unite into a much more effective fighting force. And so the fates of all life are interconnected on the planet. We're starting to understand that. We're starting to understand that what we do to the animals, we do to ourselves, and we do to the earth. So when humans hunt animals, they disrupt natural selection. They degrade ecosystems necessary for their own lives. And when they butcher animals by the tens of billions every year in factory farm systems, they poison the air, they poison the water, they degrade ecosystems and aquifers, they squander scarce resources, and they ravage rainforests, they turn grasslands into deserts. It's just a massive ecological and social catastrophe. And the intensive confinement of animals breeds diseases like SARS or the bird flu that can have devastating impact on our populations soon enough. We use the heavy use of antibiotics. 80% of all antibiotics in the U.S. are used for meat production and factory farming. 80%. And when we use that heavy load of antibiotics, we gain the consequences of that. We reap what we sow. We are now in a post-antibiotic era where many diseases can no longer be controlled through the use of antibiotics. There are important links, of course, between meat consumption and agribusiness in terms of the inefficient use of resources and precipitation of conflicts that are coming, as I described the other day. So in countless ways, the exploitation of animals rebounds to us and impacts us in countless thousands of ways. Animal liberation is by no means a sufficient condition for social change. By no means a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. And we will not have a revolution in any sense of the word until we have animal liberation. Now, we are not going to jump over the back of the left as if we can bypass the left and we can bypass this challenge of developing alliance politics. We are not going to do that, but nor are we taking a back seat to their revolution. We are going to be in the front seat, driving full speed ahead toward social change. Thank you.
So we have time for one or two short questions. All right.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Very vehement, as usual.
The good news and the bad news.
Say what? The feminists are on the way again.
News.
Yes. Here we are. I don't disagree with what you say about the left. My perspective, my standpoint is a little different. Because I began as an activist in the 1970s doing gay and liberation movement when the left was saying that that was completely irrelevant. They hated us. They told us we were bourgeois. They told us we were elite. They told us we were that gay and lesbian issues were a white thing. And as is true now, those critiques were both true and false, and were made in both good faith and bad faith. In other words, it was true that the organized gay and lesbian liberation movement initially was too white and wasn't paying enough attention to race in the same way that the animal movement is now. But of course, they were wrong that what we were up to was irrelevant to their program, etc. So the point is that today, some 30 years later, or 40? Oh my God, I'm so old. Today, of course, gay and lesbian liberation is at the very heart of leftist and progressive politics. And we did that. we effected that change. And I say we deliberately because I'm one of the people who helped to do that. And we didn't do that by posturing at them or shouting about how we're going to drive the bus now. We did it by doing two things at the same time. And one of the things that we did was by helping them to see the intersections between what they were already concerned about and what we were trying to do, helping them see that we were, in fact, up to the same project, as you've said. And the other part was to help them to see that even if we weren't up to the same project, our concerns were of weighty moral concern. So in other words, we showed them how homophobia was related to racism and sexism and things they already cared about, but we also convinced them that homophobia all by itself was a bad thing. So this is the same task that faces us, and I guess I bring to this the hope based on experience that it can be done. However, it will be harder because speciesism is deeper. Yeah. And I just want to bring forward my analysis of why they hate us so much. And why they hate us so much is where we mostly get the hate from is from white male leftists. And I think this comes down to privilege. I think it comes down to a couple things. One is that it's hard to see privilege, it's hard to give up privilege. And it's not as though men have given up their male privilege yet. They've just learned to talk about how they support women's rights. On the left. They haven't actually given up raping women on the left, and they haven't actually given up dominating their girlfriends on the left. They've just learned to say that it's a bad thing. But there are some, of course, sincere feminist men, and they've given up their privilege. It's a hard thing to get people to give up privilege. And so I think, I can't give the spiel, but I think that what we have to do is learn from the anti-racist movement, well, what works and what hasn't worked in getting people to see their white privilege and give up their white privilege.
Okay, let me build on that.
And blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. That's a good comment, and yeah. That's a good point. And so we do have models to learn from. We do have histories that are there to learn from. And that would be one example. I certainly didn't mean to say our pedagogical approach to the left should be screaming at them. And when I said, we're not going to get in the backseat of this car, I say that because what we fear is that when we start working with the left, they're going to co-opt us into their concerns. They'll be that like, yeah, sure. We're on the same team. Come on. And since, our group's a little bigger than yours, come on in ours. We tend to get absorbed and co-opted by them. That's what people tend to fear, that speciesism will be put in the back seat. That's why I say we're staying in the front seat. We're driving this car together, And certainly not scream at the left, but find a way to talk to the left, which we haven't done. And there are some examples in histories. But here's one of the points I really want to emphasize. We need these dialogues. We desperately need these dialogues between various left social movements and between the vegan and animal rights movement. Now, except for some total liberation conferences and some rare occasions, I can't think of a forum or a setting where it was really systematically designed to bring key people from different movements to talk about animal rights and veganism in a productive way, where the goal is to learn from one another. I spoke in South Africa 3 different times, so there's a challenge for vegan outreach. And we had a total liberation conference there. And I kicked off with my talk, and then there was a panel of humanists, and they all responded. And that was a productive session. We didn't see eye to eye on everything, but there were 300 people in the audience, and everyone really found this to be a positive, constructive experience. We need a whole plethora of ways of engaging in dialogue, books, forums, panels, to start this dialogue. Really, this dialogue that we need is not happening. So we can hardly get alliance politics off the ground if we don't begin with dialogue. And again, we can learn so much from one another's struggles. We're just not learning it, not in the best way we can. Another question.
Hi. Thank you so much for this important dialogue that we're having. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to ask you, earlier today, Patrice made some really important points about how we're working within an inherently violent system. And you made some important points about capitalism, and it is inherently violent, as Patrice was saying. And yet I notice over these last couple of days, a lot of us tend to fall back on terminology about this movement in terms of a war or a struggle or a fight. And it feels to me like we're taking the language of the oppressors when we do that and trying to use it to define a movement that, as you point out, is inherently a peaceful movement. Yeah. So I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, this movement's based upon the values of peace and nonviolence, and I would never deny that. I would think it's a little more complex than that, and sometimes you got to use some tough tactics like liberation to win your goal. But some people like what's his name, Gary? I forget his name. They condemn these tactics as violent. Well, they talk about taking the oppressor's mindset, huh? When you use the discourse from the Patriot Act to condemn what we're doing, well, there's a problem there. So, but in terms of war, real quickly, that's a complicated thing. I could say a lot about that. I agree with your point. We need to be careful. We can easily internalize the oppressor's thoughts, images, values if we're not careful, because it just seeps in with so pervasive in our lives. But the concept of war is not inherently an oppressor concept. We talk about the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. Well, there you go. That's a war. I'm not patriarchal for using that concept. I'm not macho for using that concept. But I think there is a legitimate war against animals. Now, whether we're in a war against exploiters or not, there is a war declared on animals. That was my talk from last year, one of them. So I think that's a legitimate sense of use of war. But you're right, and Brendan's right. If we use the discourse of war, we got to be careful, because it can condition us to act in dramatic, militant ways, and to inflate our rhetoric and discourse, and to alienate people and do counterproductive things if we're not careful with it. So I take the point in what you said. Next question.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for another very good speech.
Thank you.
So there was a lot of politics in this speech, but what I want to say is you mostly talked about the classic political scale, so the left-right, which is kind of a system of opposites, and part of this entire bigger system of aggressiveness, war, and oppression. And I wanted to ask if you have heard of, and if you have a stand on, a resource-based economy. The term is coined by Jack Fresco. Obviously, like in his ideas, there are no animal ideas integrated, that's left out. But is that a base that could be built upon as an entire politically alternative system? Yes.
Say another, well, okay, another sentence about that, because, I've heard of that, but you know more about it than I do, obviously. So what is the value of the resource economy? How does that relate to what I said the other day and what I'm saying now?
Okay, I'll have a hard time explaining the idea. It's a big idea, and it's quite utopian if you look at it in the way he presents it. Yeah. But the idea is completely to restructure human civilization, human society, and obviously the term resource-based economy, that the economy is based on how many resources are available instead of the aggressive resource usage that is being
relative to what's left.
Yes.
And sustainability. Okay, well, that's a great concept as far as I can hear it. It sounds like it has primitivist overtones, perhaps, in terms of, decivilizing or scaling back society, industrial society, way down. Population, technology. Population is one thing, technology is another thing, a little more controversial. Do we continue to use high levels of science and technology? We want to go down to less advanced levels. To the Stone Age, some would have it.
It's yes and no, because he uses very high levels of technology.
Okay, all right. So it's not primitivism, but some of the primitivists are fairly radical in this way. In terms of the left-right opposition, I did use an opposition for simplicity's sake. And the concepts of left and right have become increasingly troubled. They're hard to define increasingly because of various social political changes. I can't really go into, but One thing that the left and right have in common is, or like Western systems and Eastern systems, what used to be Eastern systems of communism, Marxist inspired systems, etc., is that they both accept anthropocentrism, certainly speciesism, but the project of the domination of nature, the industrialization of nature. And so the Earth First slogan was neither left nor right, but forward. And there's an element of wisdom in that. You know, let's get out of these political oppositions because we're ecological and we subvert that scheme. But hey, any project is political and it's going to have a left or right or some kind of orientation. You can't get out of politics. So I don't think we should be apolitical in this movement. I think that we are a leftist movement. We should identify with leftist movements. That will help a lot in opening dialogue. Hey, well, we have left values too. And we appreciate your political values and concerns. They're ours. To the extent that it is. Now, there are going to be conservatives in the movement or apolitical people, and people who want to stay single issue are going to go that way, and a lot of us are going to go this way, people who want alliance politics. And let that happen. We can't control that. Let that happen, but let's open up a new development in this movement where we have people who are leftists, who are alliance politics oriented, and trying to build a real social movement together. Let's do that as an experiment. The other people can do what they want. Maybe they'll come along after all. Maybe that project will fail. The one thing about alliance politics is, folks, it's hard. It's hard. You know, that seems to be the solution to our problem. Best thing I can come up with is alliance politics, building a political alliance that is deeper and broader than we've ever dared to imagine. That's what's on the table here. And boy, will that be hard. You know, it's hard to have a relationship with somebody. We know that in our movements, we fight each other all the time. We prefer to fight, not unite. We fight each other all the time. Imagine the complexities of working with other movements to try to build bridges with them, and then all these other complexities come in. How is that going to work? Well, we have examples of it working in history. We can hope that the cooperative side of human nature will come forward and dominate the competitive side. But it's not a given. It's not like it's going to happen like magic. There's going to be I said the other day, we are facing the most enormous challenges in our history we've ever seen right now in terms of learning how to cooperate, to share, and to stop this climate crisis. Stop it, to de-accelerate everything from fossil fuel consumption to population. We have this massive challenge, and now we have to add to this challenge, how can we work together with all these social movements, human justice, environmental, animal, and vegan? How can we pull this together to form one progressive community, one multifaceted progressive community against the war makers, against the power brokers, against the nihilists who will destroy this planet down to the last molecule for profit and with not a care to the future or to the suffering of the poor, the oppressed, and the exploited. We have got to fight that and build a super alliance, a super community that is diverse in unity and unified in diversity.
All right, one last short question, just short because the next.
Thank you for your speech. I really enjoyed it, even if there were some parts where I wasn't so sure if I agree with you. And especially one, maybe I misunderstood you, that's why I would like to ask it. At one point you said that the leftists are the Stalinists for the animals.
Stalinism toward animals.
Yeah, or something like that. And you said, I wrote it down, something like, all the humanistic and so on revolutions were fought on the back of animals. Does that imply that every progressive step we made in an effort to be a more free society on an anthropocentric level implies a worsening of the situations for the animal? Because if it was fought on the back on the animals, I understand it that way.
Yeah, I would say it was. It was because the animals were neglected, they were continued to be exploited and consumed, and no one paid any attention or they participated in it. You know, when I was in South Africa, there was this National Braai Day where progressive groups get together over roasting an animal and consuming it. It's a big progressive celebration, annual. So... Well, we know that exploitation is worsening. We know that the Holocaust is growing. And we know that the left continues to ignore it, by and large. You know, there are exceptions to the rule. There are people of progressive persuasions or left radicals who are vegans, animal rights sympathizers, or oriented in their political perspective. But by and large, the left, the liberals, the whole scale of progressive thought ignores these issues as they continue to worsen. Just like we continue to ignore so many of their issues, generally, as a vegan and animal rights community, which is tragic, I find. Anything else, or we got to go for lunch? Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I won't hold that up. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.